Hey everyone, maybe you've missed me, or maybe not, but last week there was no weekly update because I wasn't feeling that well. Now, nothing too dramatic, but enough that I didn't really feel like sitting down to record anything, which was honestly a bit frustrating. Because during that week I finished what might actually end up being my favorite book of the year. And I really wanted to immediately talk about it while the excitement was still fresh. But the upside is uh, that this update is going to be much bigger than usual because I had more time to read and I have more books to talk about. And honestly, this has been one of the strongest reading periods I've had in a while. Now, first up, I finished The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series. And this was also the series I pulled from my TBR jar for the month, and I genuinely could not have gotten luckier. Uh, you might end up randomly picking up a hyped fantasy book that ends up being just okay, but this was absolutely not one of those situations. This book completely lived up to the hype for me, and I can confidently say this is one of the best fantasy novels I've ever read. And the strange thing is that it's actually difficult to me for me to explain exactly why it works so well, because everything just comes together perfectly. Usually, when I finish a book, even one I really loved, I can point to at least one or two weaknesses. Maybe the pacing dragged in places, maybe one character wasn't that interesting, or maybe the ending just didn't fully land. But with this book, I honestly struggled to come up with negatives. The story is fantastic, and the pacing is incredibly engaging. The characters are memorable, and the dialogue is probably some of the best I've read in fantasy in a long time. Every conversation feels sharp and entertaining, and even scenes that are mostly just characters talking somehow are really interesting. And the crazy part is that this was Scott Lynch's debut novel, and that honestly blows my mind a little bit. And I think the setting also deserves a lot of praise. The city of Camor uh, feels alive in a way that a lot of fantasy cities just don't. It has this dirty, dangerous, uh, almost Venice-inspired atmosphere that's filled with crime, corruption, gangs, and lots of schemes. And it feels like a city with a history behind it instead of just a backdrop for the plot. But obviously, the biggest strength of the book is the main character himself. Locke Lamora is exactly the kind of protagonist I discovered I love reading about. He's clever, manipulative, sarcastic, overconfident, and constantly improvising. But underneath all that, there's also a surprisingly emotional side to him. He's the kind of character who can completely carry a story on personality alone. And then his friend Jean, and honestly, the friendship between Locke and Jean might have been my favorite part of the entire book. The relationship feels believable and natural, and you really get the feeling these are two people who have been through everything together. And fantasy often focuses heavily on plots and world building, and sometimes forgets emotional connections between characters. And this book absolutely does not have that problem. Another thing I loved is how well the book balances tone. It can generally be funny one moment and then suddenly become brutal or emotional the next. And there are scenes that feel almost playful and adventurous, and then scenes where you realize very quickly that the world is actually extremely dangerous. And then the twists. There were multiple moments where I genuinely had no idea uh, where the story was going next. And I also appreciated that the book feels complete by the end. Yes, it's part of a larger series, but it still works very well as a standalone story. So if you're someone who is intimidated by giant fantasy series and doesn't want to commit to 10 books immediately, I think this is actually a really good recommendation. And honestly, if Red Seas Under Red Skies, the sequel and the rest of the series are even close to this level, I completely understand why people love this book so much. And after the book I read and finished Tempest by Yoshiki Tanaka, the 7th book in the Legend of the Galactic Heroes. And this series is already one of my all-time favorites. So my expectations are always pretty high going into a new book. But unfortunately, this one didn't quite reach the level of some of the earlier books for me. I still enjoyed it overall, but it was probably one of the weaker entries in the series so far. One issue with the English releases is that the different books have different translators. You can definitely feel the difference, and this installment felt noticeably drier in terms of prose compared to some previous novels. And the dialogue and narration just lacked a bit of energy. And it also didn't help that structurally this book feels more transitional. A lot of its characters are reacting to previous events rather than major new developments happening themselves. And there are long stretches focused on political consequences, military planning, and just people responding to earlier battles instead of huge dramatic moments. Now normally I actually enjoy slower political science fiction. In fact, that's one of the reasons I love this series so much. The political discussions and ideological conflicts are often more interesting than the battles themselves. And that's still true here. What Legend of Galactic Heroes does better than almost any science fiction series I've read is explore politics in a nuanced way. It constantly compares democracy and a dictatorship while showing the strengths and flaws of both systems. And it never feels simplistic. And the two main characters, Reinhardt and Yang, are also still some of my favorite characters in science fiction. Even when less happens plot-wise, I still enjoy spending time with these characters and seeing how they think. And there were definitely still some fantastic moments in this book. Certain conversations and strategic decisions were incredibly interesting, and the ending especially was very strong. And the final part of the novel suddenly reminded me why I love the series so much. And honestly, the closer I get to the end of the series, the more attached I realize I've become to this world and these characters. And I'm already starting to feel that weird sadness you get when you know a long series you love is eventually going to end. And now currently I'm reading Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch, the second Gentleman Bastard novel. And to be honest, I just couldn't stay away from this series for a very long time after finishing the first book. The moment I finished The Lies of La Gomorrah, I immediately wanted more. Now the second book seems much more focused on pirates and gambling, which is honestly a setting I usually enjoy. And there's just something fun about fantasy stories involving ships and criminal schemes and dangerous voyages. Now I'm still fairly early into the book, but it already has the same strengths that made the first novel so entertaining. The dialogue is still fantastic, and Locke and Jean are just remain incredibly fun to follow. and the atmosphere is once again excellent. Now I've heard mixed opinions about the sequel compared to the first book, and I can honestly understand why people say the first is hard to top. The Lies of Locke Lamora feels very special, but even if this sequel ends up being only very good instead of amazing, I'll still be happy. And right now, I'm mostly just enjoying spending more time with these characters. And if I've managed to finish that novel this week, my next read will be Swear by Michael Crichton, which will actually be my first Crichton novel ever. And now I've wanted to read Crichton for years, because it seems like one of those authors whose books are incredibly readable and addictive. And people always describe his novels as fast-paced science fiction thrillers filled with scientific ideas, mysteries and tension. And that sounds exactly like something I would enjoy. And Swear especially sounds really interesting to me. Now this book is about humanity discovering an unknown object at the bottom of the ocean, and the team is sent down to investigate it. And that premise alone already hooks me. And I love stories about mysterious discoveries, isolated environments, and teams trying to figure out something they don't understand. And the underwater setting also helps a lot. There's just something naturally creepy about deep ocean stories. And the ocean already feels alien enough without adding mysterious objects into the mix. So I'm very curious to finally see what Crichton's writing is like. And hopefully it lives up to the expectations, because I could definitely use another author that writes highly readable science fiction stories. So yeah, overall, despite feeling ill for part of the last 2 weeks, this ended up being an excellent reading period. One possible Book of the Year contender, and another solid entry into one of my favorite sci-fi series, and a promising sequel on the way, and a new author coming up next. And that's honestly a pretty great stretch of reading. Anyway, let me know what you've been reading recently, and I'd love to know if you also read Lies of Locke Lamora, because I generally cannot stop thinking about the book. Anyway, that's all I have. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.